All right, so here we are at the quiz review, quiz number 1 review for Art 147. So let's get started. Hang on, here we go. So we started our quarter with talking about exposure and what that's all about. And it's all about managing light in our cameras using 3 different exposure controls. And every camera has all 3 of these exposure controls or some variation thereof. All 3 of these exposure controls, remember, are about making your photos brighter or darker, and how much you want to make it brighter or darker, or just right. And then each of them also affects individually another property in the photo, and we'll discuss that when we get to the details. So the 3 exposure controls are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So we'll start with shutter speed because it's first on the list. So shutter speed is all about time. It's the time of light that your camera sees light. So when you tap the button or push the shutter, how long does the sensor get to see light? So shutter speed, duration of light. And the other aspect of the photo that changes as you're changing shutter speed is the appearance of motion. So this is how you can freeze and make it look like it's not moving with a fast moving subject, or make something that's not moving look like it is moving, or enhance the motion by making it blurry. So lots of different ways you can do this with storytelling with shutter speed. And one thing to be careful with is the other thing, when shutter speeds get longer in time, which is a short time for us, it's about 1/30th of a second, we get to a place where you might be moving the camera just ever so slightly, or maybe a lot, and it's going to show up in your photo and result in blurry photos. And that's something we can't fix with software. We can't fix photos that are blurry or out of focus. So we get some camera motion that it makes the photo look a little jittery, fuzzy, not sharp. So here's some examples of what we can do with shutter speed with motion. So here's a car that's going about 40 miles an hour with a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. So that car, in that amount of time, 1/60th of a second, moves about a foot. So that's why it's blurry. That's a relatively short shutter speed. It's a long amount of time for you and me, but for light, that's a very short amount of time. Long amount of time, excuse me, gosh. That's a very long amount of time for light. So if we want to make the car look like it's not moving, when we get to shutter speeds faster, shorter duration than 1/1000th of a second, then we get to a place where the car, in this case going about 40 miles an hour, doesn't look like it's moving, because in that short time, it has not moved. Again, motion's okay in our photos, blurriness, if it's intentional. So this shutter speed of 1/4 of a second of a student walking down the stairs makes it look like the student's rushing, going very, very quickly, even though they're moving at normal speed. So this is for storytelling. This is to say, look, the stairs are sharp, they're not moving, but look at how fast this student is moving. So shutter speed's a great way to tell stories, especially around the area of implying speed or fast motion. Our next exposure control is aperture. That's the size of the opening in your lens. It's given a number. The smaller numbers result in larger openings. Apertures are also called f-stops. That's from the formula, the function, of how that number is derived. That's 1.8, 2.8, or whatever your number is. So, aperture, here's the summary. It's the volume of light. If you could put light in a bucket and throw it onto your photo, that would be aperture. A larger opening would be a larger bucket. You get more light. A smaller opening is a smaller bucket. Now the thing, so those will make more or less light. The other property that aperture changes in your photo, the thing that it affects besides brightness, is what's in focus. And we call that depth of field. So near to far from the camera, what's in focus? How much of that? If there's a lot in focus, we call that deep depth of field. If there's not very much in focus, we call that shallow depth of field. Aperture numbers are confusing in lots of different ways, but if you can remember this in general, if you have a smaller number, it gets more light. And as it's receiving that much light through a very large opening, that light's not very focused, so you have less in focus in the photo, shallower depth of field. You can also reverse those. A larger aperture number lets in less light and will have more or deeper depth of the field, more in focus. Confusing, I know. Hang in there. All right, let's show you some examples. So here's an example of what you get with a very large aperture opening, 1.4, and objects that are placed about 1.5 inches, 2 inches apart from each other, near to far to the camera. So in this photo, the story is about one object, one subject, the main star, the lead singer of the band, the hero. So one person is the subject and the background is blurry. Even the things that aren't very far away are not in focus. And then we go to smaller aperture number, smaller aperture opening, larger number. I still struggle with this at times. We get more in focus, and then finally on this lens, that's the smallest aperture opening, the largest number, f16, and we get more in focus. This story then is about the group, the team, the band. All of them are equally important. We still have a blurry background, but it's not as blurry. Portrait photographers love blurry backgrounds, as you'll see like in this photo. That blurry background, this is taken at the Kirkland Marina, which is a busy place. Over her top left shoulder, there's boats and stuff, but you can't see it because it's just blurry. So blurry backgrounds are great for isolating your subject, bringing attention to them and not to the stuff around them. Sometimes you need everything in focus, again, when you're doing different stories. So aperture is how you do that. What's in focus will help you tell different stories. Our third property control in exposure is ISO. ISO is like an amplifier. It's the electronic amplifier of light. So I can, when it's relatively dark, I can get more light. I can make my sensor in my camera more light using ISO. Sometimes you run out of light through, I can't go any longer with time, and I don't have a very large aperture, so I need more light, and this is one way you can get it. But beware, when you turn up the ISO to a certain level, and every camera has a different amount where this happens, you'll get some noise in the image, which is a reduction in image quality. You lose detail. I'll show an example in a moment. And again, every camera is different in how this behaves. If you have an older camera, maybe 5, 6, 7 years old, you will have a different maximum ISO number where the image quality starts degrading so much that you can't enjoy the photo. Phones in particular have relatively low maximum ISOs, right around 400, where most cameras nowadays will go to 25,600, so quite a bit more. One of the advantages of this ISO noise is it will let us use a shutter speed where I can still hold my camera still, so a faster shutter speed, because I can get rid of this noise. So this is in our classroom at 25,600, and you can see the noise. It's the color speckles on the back of the IMAX, on the white wall, on the back wall of the room. That's the ISO noise. But this shutter speed is fast enough that I didn't need to use a tripod in this dark classroom. So the photo is good and sharp, especially once I sharpen it a little bit more with noise reduction. So we can make noise less apparent. There's still a little noise in this photo, but we cannot fix if a photo is blurry due to out of focus or shutter speed that creates camera motion. So we can fix this, even though it looks kind of yucky back here. We can make it better with software in just a little bit of time. All right, so that's exposure. Aperture, shutter speed, ISO, they all make more or less light in your photos, and each of them has a property of the photo that they affect differently. Okay, so let's move on to what we want to do in changing exposure. We want to make more or less light, and we can do that on our cameras with a control called exposure compensation. That's where we decide we want to do different exposure brightness, so brighter or darker than what the camera computer wants to do. So if you're in an automatic mode, this can help you make your photos look brighter or darker. On a lot of cameras, you'll have a plus minus button somewhere on it, on the top maybe, or on the back, and that's what you would hold down and then turn a dial to activate this. Exposure compensation is where you're saying, I want more or less light than what the camera wants to do. It's your decision. It's your story. Again, darker photos have one mood that's different than brighter photos, a different story. We can change the amount of light here. So again, we're making our photo brighter or darker. The nice thing about exposure compensation, it's a great way to learn photography and brightness and have some control without, it's a great way to have control without having to learn the math. You just dial one way to make it brighter and the other way to make it darker. So it's a pretty great way to go. I used this method for a long time until just right before I started teaching this class, as a matter of fact. So it works really well. So here's an example of what exposure compensation lets you do. At the 0 photo in the top right, that is the photo that the camera wants to take. That's the normal exposure. If we go darker, that would be minus. So we want to see more of the bright things. In this photo, it's the clouds. We're bringing more attention to them by preserving them, and the darks are getting darker. So the mountain in this photo, -1, -2. And then the +1, or plus and +2, make the photo brighter. So that would bring more attention to the things that were originally darker in the 0 photo. So we have choices to make. I mean, which one is most important to you? Is it about the mountain? Is it about the clouds? Generally, though, I would recommend going maybe a little towards the minus side, not towards the plus side. If you do go plus, especially with a phone, you might get to a place where you cannot recover any details. So we can bring out usually a little bit of the shadows if like in the minus photos, -1, -2, but it's hard to bring back details in highlights if they're gone. All right, next we have the histogram. The histogram is a chart. It's a simple graph of the distribution of the tones in your image. And what that means is it's data about your photo. It's data about the exposure in your photo, the brightness of your photo. It's not information about how good the photo is necessarily, especially in this art class, but it's information about brightness level. So here's what it looks like. The way you read a histogram is on the left of the chart at 0. That's pure black. There's no light. At the right, far right, is 255. That's pure white. No detail there. And then in between, you have all the shades. So the histogram on the left represents a photo that's very bright because it has lots of black. The tones are on the brighter side of the photo. And the chart on the right is for a darker photo because most of the tones are on the dark side of the image, past towards the dark side of the midpoint. So histograms are helpful to get some data about your photo, to know what exposure is going to look like, and then you can make a decision whether you think it's going to be a photo worth working on or not. Especially the photo on the histogram of the one on the left with the bright stuff. You're going to have some details that are gone in the highlights, so you might not be able to do much with that photo. It might look not good, and it might be lovely. You never know. Histograms are a guide, again, with an art class where we don't necessarily want the accurate exposure. We want the creative exposure to tell the story. Either one of those photos might be just fine. They're just another tool for you to use. All right, next we have properties of light. Light does more than just make our photos brighter and darker. It has a lot of other ways to make our photos more interesting, and the more we can pay attention to those different properties and use them and leverage them, the more interesting our photos will be. There's 4 properties of light. We'll start with number 1, which is color. The color of light in our photos is managed with a control called white balance. White balance is the color of light in our photos. And what white balance control is doing is making sure that white, anything that's white, stays pure white. No color in it, so it's not a little green, a little blue, a little orange, a little pink. It's just white. So what this is doing is adjusting settings for the different color of light that you might have making the light in your scene. So for example, sunset color light is different than noon light on a cloudless day. So it's two different colors of light that you need to adjust for. Our eyes are great at adjusting for this. Our cameras need to do it electronically and be biased towards one color at a time. And obviously, as we're doing this, we're changing the color of light in the photo, not how bright the photo is. So this is color only, not brightness in our photos. Different color temperatures are measured in degrees Kelvin. The Kelvin scale is used to measure this. As you can see, we've got different stories here. None of these are correct. But the one on the left, the cloudy photo, that is the warmest, and I think it most matches her smile. The other ones are incorrect as well, the two blue ones, and you can see if you leave your camera, if you adjust your camera for each photo, it can be easy, at least for me it is, to forget that I adjusted it and then get a wrong setting here when I go outside from inside. Yeah, so just be aware of that. I do leave my camera on automatic white balance because it does a good job. But any of these photos, if we had them, we can fix them with software to get them back to quote unquote correct. Again, white balance is another way to tell stories with photos, to tell mood. Photos that are blue and cooler tones tend to be perceived as a little darker, quieter, maybe sad. Photos that are warmer, the red and orange tones tend to be seen as happier, more energetic, and that kind of stuff. So again, it's a mood. You can either match your subject or use them or be opposite of your subject or just slightly enhance what you want to do with white balance. And we can do this in software. I will often leave my white balance again on auto, and then I'll adjust it in software to go maybe a little warmer. That's pretty much usually what I do. I usually go a little warmer because I like that happy feeling. All right, our second property of light is quality. This is the one about feeling. It's an adjective. It's a word to describe the light and how the light and subject are being lit and how shadows appear. So this is an opinion. What does it feel like? What does it look like? And we have two general categories when we talk about light. We talk about hard light. We talk about soft light, which where the shadows have a very soft and feathered edge and they fade out. And then we have hard light, where the shadows have a definite strong edge. It almost looks like you drew it on with a marker. So soft light looks like this in fog. That's pretty obvious. That's very, very soft light. It's hazy, it's fuzzy. And then we go to another photo with a cloudy light on these little flower buds. Soft light. You can see the shadows, but it's not easy to see where they start and end. This sign in Seattle, very definite hard light, middle afternoon sun with no clouds. So you can see the edge of the shadow on those numbers very, very definitely. And then came back a couple years later with a cloudy day, and the shadow is much softer. So it's a feathered edge. Soft light, hard light are used again for stories. Soft light tends to be quieter. Hard light tends to be louder. It shows details better. So again, think about your light source and how it's interacting with your subject as you're thinking of how you want to tell your photo story. Our third property of light is quantity. That's how much light. That's the one you're probably most used to talking about and being aware of. It's just how much light there is. Our eyes are really good at dealing with this. When there's a bright light, when it's something very bright and something darker in the same image, our cameras have a little harder time with this. When you have a bright background, the subject in front of it will often be too dark, maybe get a silhouette, but sometimes that works out well. When you've got bright light outside, it's okay to make it maybe too bright. This is, overexposed for the window, but it makes the attention and focus in this photo on the ceiling, which is where I wanted it. So paying attention to light, how much there is something we're pretty good at already, but you don't always have to go with the quote unquote right amount. That's what exposure compensation will let you do, let you be creative with light quantity. And then our fourth property of light is direction. where the light's coming from. This is often helpful. We're used to seeing light coming from above and off to a side a little bit. We're used to seeing shadows that way, but we don't always have to settle for that. We can light that's doing something different than that will often be more interesting. So taking photos into the sun, watching shadows happen in an interesting way on a subject that you don't normally see, or excuse me, again, coming from behind and creating an interesting shadow here on Batman leaf. So that's the four properties of light. We have color, which is the temperature of light. Then we have the quantity of light, quality of light, which is how the light feels, how you would describe the light, the quantity of light, how much there is, and the direction of light, where the light's coming from. All those things we can use. The more you manage them and are aware of them and can leverage them in taking your photo, positioning your camera on your subject to create a more interesting photo. Next topic, what do we got? We've got lenses. Lenses are a powerful part of storytelling as well. We can change our point of view with lenses by changing how much we see. So lenses, we measure them by their focal length, which is, once we know the focal length, we understand a little bit about what the lens sees, the field of view. Is it wide angle? Is it normal, kind of like our eyes, or is it telephoto, zoomed in from far, far away? So those are measured in millimeters. We measure focal length in millimeters, and you'll see a designation mm after a focal length. That means millimeters. The smaller numbers are generally referred to as wide angle, so they see more than if you and I were just standing there looking at it. So we get to see a larger picture. A great example of this, especially here in the Seattle area these days, is this is used a lot by real estate photographers in relatively small rooms to make them look larger. Stand in a corner with a wide angle lens, it looks pretty big. And then we get to the middle numbers. Those are called normal because they approximate our field of view for our eyes. So if you want to take a photo that feels like it did, looks like it did when you were just standing there observing it, a normal lens could be a really good way to go. It feels very documentary, very, very much like this is real. And then we get to telephoto lenses above 100 in focal length, 100 millimeters. So you can stand and see the moon, see the craters on the moon, or see someone from far away and still see their face. This exaggerates and lets you tell different stories by getting closer to subjects even though you're far away from them. So focal length and lenses are a big part of our photo storytelling. Lots of photographers have lots of lenses. Some photographers only have one or two. One photographer, a good friend of mine, she only uses one lens, a 50 millimeter, and that's what she does. I have a few lenses and feel like I need them to help me tell better stories. Everybody's different on this. You can get lenses for your phones if that's what you're using for your camera. Lots of different options there, usually on the wide angle side, and there's just a couple telephotos because they're they make the phone really, really large. So that's why there's not too many of them. All right, that's lenses. Next up, we have composition. And this is moving into the more artistic side, the more personal side of making photos. It's the part where you get to decide what's in your photo and how you put all the stuff in your photo. No one will, you're unique. You will take a photo differently than anyone else, but this is the part where you get to put all of your life experience and who you are as a human being into your photo to make it different than anybody else. It's the part that is also maybe the hardest because it takes the most amount of work and effort and thinking differently. It's hard to say what the right composition is because it might be different for everyone. We all have something different we like and look at things, but if you want it to be interesting to other people, start with making it interesting to yourself. If you want to take a photo that other people will enjoy, you have to enjoy it first. So start with that as your motivation. So here's a few of the ingredients in composition. There's a whole bunch of them. These are just a few. The ones at the top on the left, those three that are in blue, I call them the superpowered ones. If you use those three, any of those three, your photo, or if you can use all three of them, especially, your photo will be more interesting. It still may not be great yet. It's got a much better chance, though, of being more and more interesting. So fill the frame. That means getting close to your subject, removing, getting so close that there's nothing else in your photo to be a distraction, to get in the way of people seeing what you want them to see. Sometimes you could do that with a telephoto lens or walking or combination, moving your body, get closer. Um, Using the rule of thirds is the second one on that list. The rule of thirds divides your subject into your frame of your photo into three sections horizontally and three sections vertically. There's something psychological in this that our brains like. It helps us. It's just an appealing, pleasing look to our eyes that if you align up on those thirds, so towards the left third, towards the right third, top or bottom, and stay away from the middle, it tends to be very, very pleasing to our eyes. There's a story that's automatically created in our brains. And again, for more detail on these, refer to the lecture notes on composition from that class. Camera position is the third superpower. That's the one where you put the camera is super important. It's a different photo from a normal standing height where everybody sees things. If you get down lower, that creates automatically more interest because you don't normally look at stuff from there. If you look at things from different angles, from around or behind, where again, most people don't go. So think about putting your camera somewhere where you would not put your eye. Where you normally wouldn't stand and look at something. And that's probably going to be a much more interesting photo. So again, those top three, if you can keep those in mind as you're taking your photos and try and use all three of them in every photo, or if not, at least use two of them, then it will be more interesting. It just takes a little more effort. Again, remember my 2-minute rule. If you don't like the photo, try 2 more minutes and take another few photos and see if you get one that makes you go, ooh, when you look at the back of your camera. All right. The other elements of composition, the ingredients we can use repetitions, things that are that have more than one or two or three of something automatically become more interesting. Again, our brains make a story out of that, and we find that interesting. Using lines to bring leading lines will show people where you want them to look. Use a line to direct the eye towards your subject. Focal length, what lens you use, that's part of storytelling and making interest. Again, if you stay away from the middle, I think it's often easier to create interesting photos. So if you go to wide angle photos and telephoto photos, that's automatically more interesting than just quote unquote normal because we don't see it as often. Symmetry, aligning things equally left, right, top, and bottom, that can be also interesting because it doesn't happen that often in nature. So by creating that, we can, again, create something that's different, unique, and interesting that people will stop and look at. Using depth of field is used to show, here, pay attention to this because it's in focus. If you want to only have people look at part of your photo, part of the photo should be sharp, in focus, and everything else should be blurrier if you can. This is easier to do, depth of field is, with a camera than a phone, due to the fact that phones have small sensors, which makes deep depth of field, and they have a fixed aperture. So it's harder to do depth of field, blurry backgrounds with a phone. Using the next one, minimalism and simplicity, removing distractions. Again, keep it to, it's hard to create a composition where everything in the frame works together. So that's why for me, I try and only have one or two things, maybe a few, because I can work with arranging that. If there's more than a few things, it's hard to make sure that everything works. So keep it simple. Keep it simple. And then last, another element in composition is using shutter speed and motion. That's very, very powerful for storytelling. If you are going for longer shutter speeds to have blurry motion, make sure your camera is supported somehow. that you've got a tripod or some other way to hold your camera still so you don't get camera shake and blurriness to offset and distract in the photo. That's something we can't fix with software. So there's your topics for the quiz. Some reminders for the quiz. The quiz will be 10 questions, multiple choice. The quiz will be closed notes, so you won't have any notes or internet access or phone to use. You'll just have to rely on what's in your brain for the answers. And then lastly, there will be one extra credit question on the quiz, a fill-in-the-blank question, which is something we've talked about throughout the quarter so far. It can only help your grade, so don't leave that one blank. So there you go. If you do have questions on any of these topics and would like additional information before the quiz, please send me an email through Canvas, and we're glad to help you. We'll see you on quiz day. Again, reduce your stress. This quiz is multiple choice, so the answers are on the page. You just have to find it. Okay, so hope that helps. If you do have questions, send me an email. So see you on quiz day.